Dead World is a comic series about, well, exactly what it sounds like. When their world is overtaken by slow-moving, flesh-eating zombies, a group of survivors initially believe they are capable of adapting to this new hostile environment. But when the zombies show signs of intelligence, when they are cunning, duplicitous, and calculated, it is a lot harder to survive. Led and controlled by King Zombie, the undead are not just hapless wanderers in search of brains, but they are intelligent predators with a world full of unsuspecting prey. First introduced to audiences in 1987, Dead World quickly cultivated a devoted following and has created a legacy for its terrifying take on post-apocalyptic zombies. Dead World is also linked to the legacy of another timeless comic. In 1988, for the 10th issue of Dead World, a back cover of an upcoming comic was included. It depicted a man standing in the shadows with a gun in one hand and a sword in the other. For some things, there is no forgiveness. This was the world's first introduction to the crow. 𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆𝖊 created the crow as a means of facing his own grief. The tragic story following a man resurrected from the grave to avenge the deaths of himself and his fiancée was inspired by 𝖕𝖕𝖆's own loss. His fiancée had been killed by a drunk driver, and 𝖕𝖕𝖆 was drowning in despair and rage. When reflecting on the creation of the series, he said, "I was still filled with such rage and frustration that I had to get it out before it destroyed me. One day I just began drawing the crow. It came pouring out." When people think of The Crow, they think of gothic romance, of The Cure, 9 Inch Nails, of all black, and of unflinching violence. But there has always been more to the story's identity. It is a garment where the fabric is grief and rage. It is unforgiving, raw, and a painstaking depiction of profound loss. There is a poetry to The Crow. It weaves between moments of unstoppable fury and moments of all-consuming pain. When Eric is not exacting revenge and righting the wrongs of the past, he is a shell, crumbled in corners and in so much spiritual pain that it feels physical. Vengeance, anger, these are the things that drive him. Without those things, there is only pain. A pain so all-encompassing that all he can do is sit in his old apartment, haunted by memories, mourning the loss of his love and the life they didn't get to have. It's an undeniably gruesome story, but what is more affecting than the violence is its depiction of grief. There is so much agony imbued into it, and it pierces right through you as you read it. Eric swings between moments of rampaging and quieter moments of reflection. In this way, we see the cyclical nature of grief, and it's heartbreaking. You can tell how personal it is, even if it is a high-concept action story. Was something this personal and so emotionally raw even capable of getting an on-screen adaptation?
Suddenly, I heard a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door.
There's nothing I can say about The Crow that hasn't already been said. Everything in this script I wrote rather quickly. I was easily able to find the words for why something wasn't quite right, you know? But talking about a movie like The Crow, a movie that works so amazingly well, has stood the test of time, and whose tragic legacy has aggrandized it as a cultural staple, it's a bit tough. There's a terrible sadness that comes with talking about this movie. There's a terrible sadness that comes with talking about the original comic. One began with tragedy and one ended in tragedy. Along with being one of the best comic adaptations of all time, The Crow is a cornerstone of goth and grunge subculture. To understand and appreciate that, you'd have to not only understand what kind of culture the comic centralized in the 1980s, but understand the kind of culture that the film was born into during the 1990s. The comic mirrored the likes of Bauhaus, The Cure, and Joy Division. The first issue was dedicated to the memory of Ian Curtis, whose music influenced 𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆𝖆 in being able to get his grief out onto the page. It was an ode to goth culture and the musicians who made it so. In the 1990s, The Crow would be released to not only the youth finding themselves in goth subculture, but also in grunge subculture. It was the era of Smashing Pumpkins, Soundgarden, and of course, Nirvana. The film was released in May of 1994, a year after the death of Brandon Lee, who was killed during production, and a month after the death of Kurt Cobain. There was already a great sense of mourning tied to this movie, and it was intensified when people saw the final film, saw its ode to goth and grunge, saw what Brandon brought to it, and saw that there was a light here that went out far sooner than it should have. The Crow became a sense of identity for a lot of people, and it continues to give voice to youths trying to find themselves year after year. The general population had a mostly positive response to the film, but critics were mixed. The best indication of how critics felt about it at the time can be found by just revisiting an old 𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆𝖆 review.
And I do think that the story is, as you described it, straightforward revenge fantasy. But I can't recommend the picture because the story bored me so much, Roger.
Well, Gene,
I mean,
comic books have stories like this, and I think that this is a very daring attempt to film a comic book.
I thought that the stories in both the pictures you named were more complicated, both Batman, another comic book story, and also Blade
Runner story was so complicated that even after the director's cut came out, nobody was able to explain it.
I miss those guys. Surely enough, though, as time has passed, more and more people have recognized it for the truly great film that it is. It is an amazing achievement on so many levels. First off, in order to capture the melancholy of Detroit, to really capture the feel of such a vicious place, they made use of miniature sets. That way they could really make the darkness of the story feel inescapable. This was also done because budget-wise, it was just a bit easier, but it really helps in creating a strong atmosphere for the film. The opening shot depicting Detroit on fire is a miniature set. Some shots in the car chase scene were done on a miniature set as well. Financially, the movie did alright. One might call it a modest success. Surprisingly modest when you consider just how big the movie has become over the last 30 years. But the legacy of this film isn't about critical acclaim, and it's not about financial gain. It's about the legacy of Brandon Lee. This is definitely a choice on my part, but I kind of don't want to get into the details of Brandon Lee's death during the making of this film. I feel like it's one of those things that can certainly become ghoulish depending on how people talk about it, so I wanted to take a moment to instead highlight Lee's life, celebrate that, and point out some of the cool and endearing things he did in this movie. The studio was initially thinking that it would be smart and beneficial to get a musician to play him. Eric was deeply influenced by musicians after all, with 𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆 famously saying he designed the character by putting Peter Murphy's face on Iggy Pop's body. If they went with a musician, the studio could count on not only fans of the comics showing up to the theater, but also fans of whatever musician they ended up going with. But 𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆 knew he wanted an actor, and he had 3 candidates: River Phoenix, Johnny Depp, and Christian Slater. Slater was the most popular contender, but he was too hot at the time and cost way too much money. The second most popular choice was Phoenix. No one expected Brandon Lee at all. I don't think anyone saw him coming.
Okay, I'll make you a deal. What I gave Stuart, you can have that.
It's not good enough.
Lee was recommended to 𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆, but he wasn't convinced, at least not until he met Brandon and immediately saw the potential. During the course of pre-production and filming, 𝖕𝖕𝖆𝖆 would actually become great friends with Brandon as well as 𝖒𝖕𝖚 𝖚𝖃, Brandon's fiancée. Not only was Lee a big fan of the comics, but he had a level of charisma that no one was prepared for. Plus, he had the physical capability to handle the role. A skilled martial artist, a student of Muay Thai, and certified in the Thai Boxing Association, Lee had more than enough skills to do quite a few of his own stunts. And he did, like a pro. Brandon Lee brought the role to life so beautifully and seemingly so effortlessly. The truth was that he worked hard to make the character come to life. He was committed to slimming down his frame to match the character. He trained daily. He took on the role not just physically, but also philosophically. There were stories about him going around long before production began and asking a similarly phrased question to almost every person he came across. If you died and had the chance to come back for 2 days, would you tell the people you loved? Or would you spare them the pain? Lee was a deep thinker in so many aspects of his life, and he brought that depth to Eric. He's the reason why such a profoundly personal story was able to be brought to life. He balanced gentleness, desperation, anger, and charisma in his performance, and he knew how important of a performance it would be for him. After Brandon was killed, production completely stopped. Paramount dropped the picture and wanted nothing to do with it. There was consideration of even destroying what had been filmed. Miramax swooped in at the last second and funded all the special effects needed to complete the film by using Chad Stahelski, who would later go on to direct the John Wick franchise, as a body double for the scenes Lee hadn't been able to complete. Every time I watch The Crow, I'm grateful that it wasn't shelved. If it had been, we never would have been able to see just how amazing Lee was. If it had been destroyed, a big part of his legacy would have been destroyed with it, and we never would have seen all the hard work he put into making this a reality. I think Roger Ebert said it best in his review for the film. There was talk of shelving The Crow, but I'm glad they didn't. At least what Brandon Lee accomplished, in a film that looks to have been hard, dedicated labor, has been preserved. There is something very sacred about Eric Draven. Keeping in mind that technically Eric Draven doesn't exist in the comics. In the first issues, he's just Eric, no last name. That means Eric Draven is and always will be Brandon Lee.
Tell them Eric Draven sends his regards.
𝖕𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆 said something to that effect in 2014 when production was supposed to begin for a remake of The Crow starring Luke Evans. When asked about how he felt about Evans playing Eric, he said, "If you read the comic, Eric and Shelley never have their last names revealed. Hopefully this is one area the new movie, being more faithful to the comic, will come into play. And Eric won't be going by Eric Draven in the new film. Luke Evans may play Eric, but Brandon Lee will forever be Eric Draven. No one understands that fear more than me. Brandon Lee was a friend, and I'd never do anything to hurt his legacy." And that was it. The Crow started and ended there. Or so many had hoped.
I had a dream about you.
There's an alternate universe where The Crow's City of Angels is not bad. Definitely not great, let's not get crazy, but not bad either. This would be the timeline where the Weinsteins weren't involved in the production and didn't insist on destroying the film so that it was more like the first one. Unfortunately though, this isn't the Umbrella Academy and there aren't multiple timelines. Who am I kidding? It's a great thing that this is an Umbrella Academy.
It's on.
What happened to you?
It's on and popping up in here, you feel?
What happened to you?
What?
You didn't used to be like this, Schmidt.
What are you talking about?
You've gotten so much worse.
After the success and cult following gained with The Crow, Miramax could only smell one thing: franchise potential. Everyone was flummoxed as to how the company could possibly create a franchise from the film. Both the lead character and the lead actor had passed on, and recasting didn't seem like a possibility. But then the idea cropped up that maybe the Crows have been helping people like this for decades, centuries even. Maybe there are many, many people with stories like Draven's, people given an opportunity to come back from the dead to right a wrong. And voila, there isn't just one Crow. There are hundreds. City of Angels focuses on Ash Corvin, who, along with his son, was murdered in cold blood. Ash is reincarnated as the Crow and aided by Sarah Moore, who is now an adult and works as a tattoo artist. Together, they try to avenge Ash's death and send some well-deserving assholes to the pits of hell. For whatever reason, Ash and Sarah fall in love over the course of the film despite having the chemistry of a Snickers bar and a clove of garlic. Of all the abysmal sequels, I have a lot more grace towards City of Angels because it never got the chance to be its own thing. Director Tim Pope and screenwriter David S. Goyer wanted to approach the story differently. When they signed on, they knew if they were going to do it, they wanted it to be respectful to Brandon Lee's memory. One of their earliest pitches actually would have followed Sarah as an adult, where a tragedy would lead to her becoming the Crow, but this pitch was rejected. Come to think of it, actually, these two were the only filmmakers to have even considered having a woman return as the Crow.
I consider for the benefit of my patients.
The first woman to appear as the Crow was in The Crow Flesh and Blood, which was published in 1996. But no filmmaker had ever considered, to my knowledge, an adaptation with a woman being resurrected by the Crow, other than Pope and Goyer. It's actually really funny. Rob Zombie would write a script called The Crow 2037 that followed a mother and her 8-year-old son being brutally murdered, and the idea of bringing a woman back to be the Crow seemed so unfathomable to Zombie that he instead wrote the 8-year-old boy being resurrected with the body of a 30-year-old man to avenge his mother's death. Anyway, I got distracted. For City of Angels, 𝖕𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆 intended to write the script himself, but it was very painful, and he soon admitted that he couldn't do it because all he could think about was Brandon Lee. He eventually gave his blessing to write the script, so long as he made it his own story. They sprinkled in homages to the original comic and to the first film. Eric's old theater masks show up. In this version, Ash is a mechanic, which is a reference to Eric having been a mechanic in the first comic. And of course, there's a link with the return of Sarah. But all the homages were meant to be just that. Originally, Pope and Goyer planned for it to be a very different story out of respect to Lee. They even made sure that Ash's behavior as the Crow was different from how Lee became the Crow. They had different ideas, an entirely different ending that never saw the light of day because Miramax producers, Bob and Harvey Weinstein, saw the final cut and insisted on more edits to make the film more similar to the 1994 version. When Pope refused, the Weinsteins took the film and had it cut beyond recognition. They even edited a director's cut that Pope had no involvement in. The experience was so bad and so creatively stifling that both Pope and Goyer eventually disowned the film.
It's time for a fresh start.
Yeah, a fresh start, exactly.
Good. Jimmy. I'm on adopting you. What? I don't think unadopting is the right word. Legally, I'm disowning you.
The movie is terrible, but I can't blame it all on the writer and director. When I hear about their initial ideas for the story, their original ending, their original sequence of events, I just feel bad for them. They set out to make a story that would fit nicely with The Crow, while managing to be its own thing at the same time out of respect for 𝖕𝖕𝖊 and 𝖕, and they were robbed of that opportunity. The whole thing is a mess, but there is one thing I thought was funny. There's a scene where one of the people involved in Ash's death goes to one of those strip club places where there's a window, I don't know what it's called. And he runs out of time before he finishes, so the partition goes back down while the woman is still undressing. The goon quickly pays for the partition to go back up, and sitting in the woman's place is Ash, and he says,
"Do you want me, baby?"
I don't know, I just think that's gold.
I put 2 bullets in you.
So, go for 3.
Stairway to Heaven gets overlooked a lot when we talk about adaptations and iterations of The Crow. Understandable. Short-lived TV shows tend to fade into obscurity, and the ones that don't are the exceptions, not the rule. It's unfortunate because as far as iterations of The Crow go, it's probably the best one after the original adaptation. There are huge flaws, of course. The biggest one being that this one fails to capture the mood of Eric Draven's story. The doom, the gloom, the goth pain of it all. But it's not bad, which given the history of on-screen crows, is a miracle. All 3 movies kind of suck, with the last 2 in particular competing for who can be the most boring. Stairway to Heaven differentiates itself from the film sequels because it focuses on the storyline we've already seen before in the film, but expands the story so that we get a little more of Sarah, a little more of
Officer Albrecht.
Unfortunately, being a TV show that aired with regular programming, it lacked the grotesque and violent nature of the original story. When looking at the other film adaptations, there's no shortage of violence and depravity, but there's an absence of story, of heart, of care for the characters, and, quality. The television adaptation is the complete opposite. I'd say in terms of decent character work, it's actually the best on-screen version of The Crow after the original adaptation, easily. But it's easy to feel disappointed by it because the thing that majorly characterizes The Crow, more than the violence and depravity, is this overwhelming sense of despair. Visually, this feeling is characterized by sharp shadows, dark skies, and this indescribable grime that overtakes the cityscape. You won't find any of that in the show, though it does the best it can with the resources it has. The Crow, particularly Eric's story, is also characterized audibly with its goth soundtrack. Music is the heartbeat of not only the 1994 film, but of James O'Barr's original comic, which was interspersed with lyrics from Joy Division and The Cure. The Crow is a story whose identity is tied deeply into music. Before the release of the 1994 film, a soundtrack to the comic was released with never-before-seen illustrations. Fear and Bullets, a collaboration between James O'Barr and John Bergen of Trust Obey, was released in 1994, coinciding with the release of the first film. Putting it simply, if the Crow series is Eric, for example, then music is Shelley. Forever linked, you can't have one without the other. The TV show understood that, and the music executives were very careful about the songs selected in each episode. And during the end credits of each episode, Mark Dacascos had a voiceover highlighting what music was used. Dacascos is pretty decent as Eric. He's sensitive, soft-spoken, and funny.
The situation you're describing seems a little unusual, that's all.
The situation is I was murdered. I went away someplace. Now I'm back. Rock and roll can't handle that.
The biggest issue I have with this show, though, is that in order for it to exist as the series with multiple seasons that it was intended to be, it had no choice but to needlessly expand Eric's mission. He's in the mortal world to avenge his and Shelley's deaths, but occasionally he'll get roped into solving someone else's problems, turning him into more of a superhero who is only partly motivated by revenge and partly motivated by saving other people. It's actually kind of funny because even though his primary focus should be revenge, he does find himself often dealing with mundane inconveniences, such as having to pay rent.
Look, you want this space? You pay the rent.
The series tries to capture more of the comic while also not doing it at all. For instance, Skull Cowboy shows up, a character in the comic that doesn't exist in the film because the actor's scenes were cut. I do think it's funny that he doesn't show up until episode 8, by which time Eric has already figured out that he's this undead being, and he's like, "Eric, you're dead." And Eric's like, "Fucking no." The series expands on the relationship between the detective and Eric, Eric and Sarah, Sarah and Darla.
I was brave too. I had to be, for Rebecca. I don't think you'll make it as long as I did, though.
And we also get scenes of Shelley in the afterlife waiting for Eric to return to her. These aspects don't work for me personally, but they're a hell of a lot better than what we eventually get from the sequels. I guess I have to talk about those.
Guess it's true. Guns don't kill people. Think maybe knives do?
So this one's story is that Rob Zombie was working on his freaky little version of The Crow, but Miramax, having seen the success of films like Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer, wanted something more akin to a teen Scream horror flick. They asked the Zombie if he would change his script to suit this new direction, and he, frustrated with 18 months of working for this film that never got off the ground, was like, fuck it, I'm out. They got a new screenwriter, attached a new director, and were able to bag Kirsten Dunst, so they felt like they had a good start. This was the film, finally, that would revive the series after the disappointing performance of City of Angels. The studio really wanted this to be a Batman type of thing, franchise-worthy. They wanted spin-offs, toys, video games that we don't talk about or acknowledge. And this would be their ticket to getting that. They were smelling money, possibility, and a revived franchise. Then they had 2 test screenings that scored so negatively, they quietly released it straight to DVD in January. The Crow Salvation is honestly just kind of tedious. Kind of, maybe a bit too kind. It's incredibly tedious. City of Angels, at the very least, tries to have fun with its approach to how Ash behaves as the Crow. Ash's version is more of a trickster who, for some reason, does magic tricks. I don't understand it, but it's different, and it's definitely entertaining in a way. This version of the Crow, wherein Alex Corvus becomes the vigilante, is, bless its heart, so bland. This installment follows a young man wrongfully executed for the murder of his girlfriend, and he returns to the mortal realm and not only tries to avenge her death, but tries to solve the mystery of who actually killed her and clear his own name. Conceptually, it's fine, and it is a rather interesting approach to include the aspect of Alex simultaneously trying to clear his name. And this one has another benefit of adding in the complexity of who is culpable and who isn't. Where the first 2 adaptations focus on the evil of street gangs and individual scum, this one also focuses on the most connected gang there is, the police. This one makes it clear that corruption doesn't begin and end with corruption among individuals, but that it goes farther with organizations and... fuck me, it's Uncle Baby Billy.
There will come a payday, hallelujah, what a payday.
It goes farther with corrupt organizations and people in positions of power and authority. It's honestly such a good concept to have a crow going after crooked cops in a fucked judicial system, but it's wasted here. It's an absolute slog to get through, the pacing isn't good, the character work is worse, and apart from one chase scene, even the action leaves a lot to be desired. And the studio knew very well how disappointing this one turned out, which is why they only released it in one theater in Spokane, Washington, before its DVD release. They had a stinker, and it was better to just quietly dump it than acknowledge its existence. The main actor, 𝖒𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆, actually auditioned to play Eric Draven for the 1994 film, but was turned away for being too young. He also auditioned to play Funboy, the role that eventually went to Michael Massey. In a way, it's cool that he got a chance to play a version of The Crow, but in another way, it makes you deeply appreciate the casting directors for The Crow 1994, because they knew then what became very evident in Salvation. 𝖒𝖕𝖕𝖆 may be a good actor with better material, but he did not have the charisma needed to make the Crow an intriguing character. Salvation has so much potential, but nothing was done with it, and it is the most offensive to me personally because I like Kirsten Dunst, and I don't like it when she ends up in movies that waste her time or her talents. Very offensive this movie is. There's absolutely no energy to this film, and you can tell because its 90-minute runtime feels 3 times longer than it actually is. It is so dull you can't help but wonder if Alex Corvus is trying to exact revenge on the audience too. Death by boredom. You never feel invested in anyone or anything or how they were wronged, which is a shame because this is the only film version to focus on the corruption of people in positions of authority like crooked cops. It could have been done really well, and I don't know what the fuck happened, but it's still better than whatever happened in 2005.
I want to die. I want to die. Do it. Do it, please. Please.
Oh God. I really would rather not talk about Wicked Prayer. I don't think anyone wants to talk about Wicked Prayer. But I'll try. This retelling follows Jimmy Cuervo, an ex-con who plans to run away with his girlfriend Lily following his release. Before they can run away and elope, they are killed by a gang of Satanists led by Angel and Tara Reid. Like Salvation did 5 years before, this version moves away from the grimy big city to the outskirts of Arizona. There's something about a poison lake, a casino, and a mining company that's about to shut down and lead to a massive loss of jobs. There's some segregation type things thrown in, with the idea of our young lovers being star-crossed lost not only because of their tragic end, but because in life they were kept apart because of their different races. You see, Jimmy is white, and his girlfriend Lily is native. Supposed to be native. Out of all the sequels, this one has to be the most mind-numbing for so many reasons, but the biggest one is probably that it wants to be about Native American characters, and there ain't a native in the fucking room. It's doubly annoying when you consider that in 1996, the second Crow story ever made was called The Crow Dead Time, and it was about an indigenous man, Joshua, getting revenge on the Confederate soldiers who murdered him and his family. I would have liked to see the story adapted on the big screen, importantly with native voices behind it. They clearly thought that any white person with an olive skin tone must be Native American, and that's how we ended up with this mess. This movie has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. At least with Salvation, you can say the aspect of focusing on Alex getting back at corrupt cops sounds interesting. At least with City of Angels, you can appreciate that they took a different route by having a father getting revenge for the murder of his son. There is nothing you can say that is even remotely positive about Wicked Prayer. Everything from the casting to the plot just makes you want to beg for it all to stop. Please stop. The whitewashing of native characters is the most glaring issue with the casting. The smaller issues come down to things like you can't have David Boreanaz playing a charming cult leader because you need someone who, you know, is charming. Tara Reid is not a good actress and never has been, bless her heart. Edward Furlong is the farthest thing from menacing. There's one scene where he's threatening Yuji Okamoto and he just looks like a kid having a temper tantrum.
Where's fucking Luke?
This sequel focuses equal time on the villains and on the Crow, which should be interesting on paper, but in execution adds nothing but unnecessary scenes to an already bloated runtime. Tonally, it feels more like a parody than a real Crow movie, and it's so fucking bright. There are multiple points where you can tell the story has run out of gas, but because it hasn't reached a proper runtime, it just keeps going. From the moment it starts, you can't wait for it to be over. It is cartoonish, completely absent of darkness and the raw feel of what makes a Crow story a Crow story. It's so obvious and heavy-handed that Angel and his merry gang of Satanists who are trying to open the gates of hell are all named, get this, after the 4 horses of the apocalypse. I'm not even joking. But at least Angel has a real name. It's Luke Crash. And his girlfriend/fiance, played by Tara Reid, is named Lola Byrne. Get it? I don't know. This movie feels like a 12-year-old's fan fiction after watching The Crow for the first time. It is so unserious that I almost can't be mad at it. Like, it's just there, and it is what it is.
I now pronounce you devil and his shorty.
I love you, Lucifer.
Well, kiss the bride, motherfucker.
Wicked Prayer had a 1-week theatrical release and fortunately was condemned to purgatory. That is, immediate DVD release. It can't hurt us now. I already mentioned the Rob Zombie production, The Crow 2037. I don't know much about Zombie's ideas, but if his ideas for Halloween are any indication, I'm kind of glad 2037 didn't get a chance to exist. I'm sorry if that's mean. There was also talk of a version directed by 𝖆𝖕𝖕𝖊𝖆 Gutierrez. Gutierrez had a very unique vision for the film. He pitched a version in black and white where it felt like a comic book in motion. His idea was that no one would ever be able to replace or improve on what Proyas achieved in 1994. So rather than try to remake the film, he wanted to adapt the comic book again, closer to the comic both narratively and visually. James O'Barr was on board for this remake, and when asked about it in 2014, stated clearly that it was not a remake. We're not remaking the movie, we're re-adapting the book. My metaphor is that there is a Bela Lugosi Dracula, and there is a Francis Ford Coppola Dracula. They use the same material, but you still got 2 entirely different films, and I think there's room for both of them. Part of the appeal of the Crow comics, after all, is that they can tell very different stories. There was also The Crow Lazarus. Strap in for this one, I want to tell you more about it. Since I found out that we could have had Lazarus, it's been on my mind a lot. This retelling would have seen a rapper whose prime was cut short by a senseless shooting and who returns to figure out who killed him. The screenwriter for that project was James Gibson, and he went into stark detail on how this version of the story would have played out. Inspired by the real-life murders of Tupac and Biggie, Gibson wrote what was basically a gothic rap opera with biblical betrayal and violent reckonings. He pitched it it to Edward Pressman, the producer for all of the previous Crow films, which was ideal for a few reasons. He was also the producer for Phantom of the Paradise, an amazing movie that Gibson was not only a huge fan of, but that greatly influenced his vision for the Crow, Lazarus. To seal the deal in this meeting, Gibson told the board who he had in mind for the Crow: a rapper with a dark side, a spiritual side, a rapper whose songs were filled with the same gothic atmosphere that the Crow series had become synonymous with. DMX. To really drive it home, he brought in a copy of DMX's album, Flesh of My Flesh, Blood of My Blood. Gibson showed them the cover and said, "This is your Crow, right?" And they all agreed. It definitely was. The plot involved the idea of having two crows, one mostly good and one mostly bad. The creators went to Eminem with the idea, and even though Eminem was rather picky about his projects, he was quoted as saying, "If DMX is gonna do it, I'm gonna do it."
And the Source Award for Best Performance goes to... Who's the winner? Where my dogs at? DMX! Why DMX?
There's a full interview with Gibson where he really gets into the nitty-gritty of it all. I recommend reading it. It's very fascinating, and I'll leave it in the description. I don't know, I just think this could have been really good in the right hands, but unfortunately this one didn't get made, because this one did. Even though they had a director attached and two huge stars, Miramax didn't want the film. One of the Weinsteins, I can't remember which, was quoted as saying, "No one wants to see a film about rappers." When recounting his experience trying to get this movie off the ground, Gibson recalled that even if they had been given the green light, they would have been met with pushback because of all the changes. His view, like many others, was that the story of revenge in The Crow could happen to anybody, anyone off the street, that the series lended itself to the freedom of anthology, but he knew there would have been pushback regardless. It could have been a fun movie, but it's not like, oh my god, it's some great loss of civilization. And I'm sure a lot of the die-hard Crow fans might not have been too happy with some of the changes made. I remember at the time, even some of the message boards, there was like, "Oh no, you can't make it with a black lead. You can't have it be hip-hop. That's disgraceful to Brandon Lee's memory." There was always going to be that kind of faction, but I think it would have played. After that fell through, Miramax went ahead and gave a small budget to get The Crow, Wicked Prayers started. Since Miramax had decided that the Crow franchise wasn't good for anything but direct-to-DVD releases, this was the best fans of The Crow could get, an occasional on-screen adaptation made half-heartedly and tossed aside like scraps for a stray dog. I sound hurt, don't I? Sorry. This version of The Crow, the 2024 version, has been in production hell for a ridiculously long time. So many stars were attached at so many different points, and in 2016, one of those stars happened to be Jason Momoa. Titled The Crow Reborn, it was unclear if this version was meant to follow Eric Draven or another incarnation. The release date was set for October of 2019, but pretty soon, Momoa backed out of the project, suggesting that the story wasn't being approached with the care he would have liked for it to have. It's kind of funny. When Momoa was in talks to be in a reboot, there was backlash, but after the first pictures of Skarsgård as the Crow were posted online, suddenly everyone thought Momoa would have been a great idea. And I see this recur a lot. Any actor would be better than the actor they have. No one wanted Momoa to do it. He was far too buff. But now that Skarsgård has done it, some people say Robert Pattinson would have been ideal. And I feel confident in guessing that even if Robert Pattinson was attached, there would still be naysayers. It's to be expected. People are protective of Brandon Lee's legacy and don't like the idea of anyone trying to replace him or replicate him. City of Angels followed an entirely different character, and this was done specifically to be respectful to Lee, by not having anyone else play Eric. But when it came out, people still couldn't help but compare him to Lee. When this is your first introduction to the world, to the Crow, everything else is always going to pale in comparison. Everyone seems to have wanted this take on the Crow to fail in a big way. Some insist that it's bad, a waste of time, even without seeing it. So let's finally talk about The Crow 2024. When the trailer for Rupert Sanders' iteration of The Crow dropped, there was a lot of disappointment online, as you might imagine. The complaints ranged from this version of Eric looking stupid to this movie being disrespectful to Brandon Lee's legacy. This version of Eric does leave a lot to be desired from purely an aesthetic standpoint, but on the second one, Bill Skarsgård may be the first person to play Eric in a movie since Lee's death, but he's not the first person to play Eric, as we've already established in the section on Stairway to Heaven. I'm not of the mind that this movie simply existing is disrespectful to Lee's legacy, and I don't think it can hurt his legacy. It can't erase it. The life he brought to the role can never be undone. If a short-lived TV series and 3 abysmal sequels couldn't take away the greatness of what he achieved, I think it's safe to say that nothing will. I completely understand having this knee-jerk reaction to the movie, though. I had the same knee-jerk reaction. I can also understand what a bind the creatives behind this film must have been in, because everyone has a different idea of what is respectful to Lee's legacy and what isn't. Before production began for The Crow, City of Angels, director Tim Pope and screenwriter David S. Goyer spent a lot of time on message boards keeping track of what hardcore fans of The Crow had to say about a potential sequel. Overwhelmingly, the response was that if they were going to make another story, they should do their own thing and not try to mimic Lee, as that would feel like a parody. Actor Ernie Hudson shared his thoughts on the newest film and said, although he had a lot of respect for Skarsgård, he didn't think the movie needed to be revisited, and if it were to be done anyway, it should be done completely different from what they did in 1994. Most of the time, that's what you hear, that if another adaptation of The Crow is going to come to fruition, the creators must try their best to make it their own thing. Doing a poor imitation of the greatness that had already been achieved in the 94 version would be disrespectful. But then there are others who believe that keeping it the same would be more respectful. For example, Rochelle Davis, who played Sarah in the original film, said that they should have cast someone who looks more like Lee, as that would have been more respectful. When the first image of Bill Skarsgård playing the character was released online, the major sentiment was that it was a huge downgrade, and it looked too different from the original character first brought to life by Lee. It's clear that the movie was always going to be in a tough position. If it was too different from the original, it would be looked at negatively. If it was too similar, it would be looked at negatively. I understand being underwhelmed by Skarsgård's appearance in the film. I'm especially resentful of the tattoos, this one in particular. See, the good is crossed out so that you know he is just boy. But I'm also of the mind that going in an entirely different direction for Eric was likely done out of respect. It was the creator saying, we will never be the 94 film and we will never replace Lee, and we're not trying to. Maybe I'm giving them too much grace here. Taking it into a vastly different direction may not have fully translated for this adaptation, but I can respect why it was done and how it was intended. I can safely say that this is not a remake. It's another adaptation, almost a reimagining of the original comic with a lot of changes. But if you're going in expecting it to be a shot-for-shot remake of The Crow, prepare yourself, because that's not at all what this is. There's no T-Bird, no Top Dollar, no Fun Boy, no Tintin, no Sarah, no Detroit. It takes place in a different location, and something that I actually like is we spend a great deal of time getting to know who Shelley is. And I'll come back to that later. With all that said, it's completely valid that most people were expecting this to be a remake. After all, the main character's name is still Eric, and given how different it is, I feel like they could have just made an entirely new character similar to what the previous sequels have done. I do think it's curious though that of all the existing stories in the Crow comic universe, we rarely see one of those getting adapted. There are so many characters you could adapt a Crow story from, so we don't really need for it to be Eric again. This Eric, 24 Eric, did not need to be named Eric at all. This Shelley didn't need to be Shelley. These characters are so fundamentally different, the circumstances are so different, and the lore is slightly different. I question how or why they wanted to call him Eric when he easily could have been someone else. In fact, let's rename him. I bestow on you the name Adrian, and you will now be Dahlia. It's really close to Talia. I know it's lazy, but it's done. Recreating the story also provides an opportunity to do more things from the comic that hadn't been implemented before. There is plenty of room for a retelling that's closer to the comic, but that's not what The Crow 2024 is. All they had to do was add a colon like the previous sequels, The Crow Demons, or I don't know, The Crow Apotheosis, and change the character names. It's good that it's different from Eric's original story, but at the same time, it is not an adaptation of the first book, and it's not Eric, and that's okay. What's not okay is making him out to be Eric. All that said, this is easily the best Crow movie we have had since 1994. The bar is in hell, but still. For this portion of the video, feel free to stop paying attention to the screen. Because this movie hasn't come out yet, I don't have a lot of clips to work with, and also Lionsgate is being a real bitch about the clips that I do have. So occasionally I'm gonna throw something up on the screen, but for the most part, it'll be the same few stills and posters that you've already seen. Just think of this section as a podcast episode. Half video, half podcast, 2 for the price of 1, I don't know. I walked away from this movie feeling grateful that it wasn't as bad as it could have been, and it also wasn't as bad as the last Crow story to be adapted on screen. Once you let go of any remake expectations, you are much more easily able to just enjoy it for what it is. The story starts with Shelly, who gets a call from her friend Zadie. Zadie's freaking out, and she tells Shelly that they need to leave town before shit goes down. Shelly is still trying to understand what's going on when Zadie's call drops, and she knows something has gone horribly wrong. We follow Shelly as she leaves to go help Zadie, but as she's walking down the street, she notices someone is following her, and she also notices policemen up ahead. Shelly purposely runs into the police and drops her purse in the process, spilling out its contents and revealing a good amount of drugs. The person who is following her switches gears, but not before glaring at Shelly, and Shelly is arrested for possession. She's sent to a sort of rehabilitation center, and that's where she meets Eric. The two of them are immediately taken with one another, and from here we start to see their relationship blossom. But of course, whatever was waiting for Shelly on the outside is still waiting, and this brief repose she has with Eric can only last for so long. Eventually, they're both found, Shelly is killed, Eric as well, as collateral damage, and then we see the Crow story start to unfold. I'll start with the pros. The cinematography is decent, the underwater scenes are especially nice. I don't know if this is a popular or unpopular opinion yet, but I like the idea of Shelly and Eric's relationship developing. I think their relationship should have been established, but at the same time, I don't hate this take. Making their love a new development for Eric adds a layer of tragedy to it all. We understand him to be a character haunted by the past, one who has never really found happiness. So getting to see him experience love and happiness for the first time does make us feel for him when it's all snatched away so suddenly. The music choices are good, and I want to expand on that later because I feel like the marketing really did a disservice to the film. There's some Joy Division, which, as we already know, was a huge influence on the comic, some Gary Newman, and excitingly, some 𝖒𝖕𝖊𝖆𝖆. Her music has come to be used almost ironically in recent years, so it was nice to see that in this film it was used to add gravitas to a moody scene, and I appreciated the lack of irony. But by far, my favorite thing about this iteration is I get to know who Shelly is. I want to be clear before I delve into this criticism. James O'Barr wrote The Crow to deal with his own grief of losing his very real fiancé to a senseless and violent crime. So when I critique this trope, please omit O'Barr from it. His was a personal experience. Everyone else writing the screenplays for the sequels were just repeating the trope without having a personal connection. So to make it extra clear, this does not apply to O'Barr, okay? Okay. The dead lovers trope can be exhausted in the revenge subgenre. Oftentimes these characters, usually women, are rarely given much characterization and don't have much to do beyond laughing and dying over and over again in flashbacks. I would say stories like these risk flattening the characters, but the truth is, more often than not, storylines like these don't bother to flesh out these characters in the first place. In the grand scheme of things, these characters don't really matter, which again, excluding the first Crow and the comic, can rub me the wrong way at times. For this version, they saw there was an opportunity to give the love interest a little more complexity, and I'm glad they took advantage of it. It's nice to get to see this character outside of how the Avenger character views her. She gets to be her own person first, before being a dead lover. Some of the characterization they gave her is also a direct reference to the comic, which is kind of fun. For example, she has a tattoo of the same theater masks that inspired the comic, the ones you'll find in the occasional panel, and the one hanging on Eric Draven's mirror. She admires the poetry of Arthur Rimbaud and recites a piece to Eric. In the original comic, there are like 2 pages dedicated to different Rimbaud poems. This version of Shelly, or Dahlia, if you will, is very bold and direct in all the ways that Eric is not, and she's artsy, a singer, and a classical pianist. We just get to know who she is, and I appreciated that. Now for all the things I didn't like. It comes down to 2 elements. The villain, which I dislike, and the ending, which I despise.
Spoiler warning, spoiler warning, spoiler warning.
The villain this time around is Vincent Rogue, an uber-wealthy and powerful person who turns out to have made a deal with the devil for immortality. Offering up innocent souls to hell, he gets to live in eternity. He also has this strange superpower where he can whisper some growly nonsense in your ear and get you to kill yourself. He's basically an overpowered version of the trees from The Happening.
What? No!
This villain is perhaps the weakest thing about the story. Nothing about him feels especially threatening, and his modes of execution are needlessly complicated. I think his supernatural element does a little bit of a disservice to the story as well. He feels like a stereotypical rich villain that we've seen time and time again. Nothing stands out, and the whole thing is kind of, well, bland. So you're thrown off by the villain, but the blow is softened because some of the action sequences are well done. Unfortunately, the ending comes in full swing to ruin everything. In an interview with Esquire in May of 2024, Bill Skarsgård said that he would have preferred a more definitive ending for the film, and I have to agree with him. The 2024 film ends with Eric having made a deal. He would trade his soul for Shelley's soul so that Shelley could be brought back to life. When he completes his revenge, Shelley returns to the land of the living and Eric dies, left in the afterlife limbo. This ending, and I don't want to mince hairs here, is dumb and the worst. Just from a logical standpoint, it doesn't make any sense. Eric and Shelley are killed, and Shelley is buried. For some reason, however it happens, when Eric completes his mission, Shelley is brought back to life. But she doesn't crawl out of a grave or anything, which would make the most sense, given the fact that she was buried. She just wakes up to EMTs in the room where she initially died. This is fucking confusing. The story suggests that time was somehow bent, and if time was somehow bent, are we to believe that the people Eric killed are still alive because the time never actually passed for him to fuck them up? Or are we to believe everything stayed the same and that all the people who died during the course of the film are still dead, even though for one of those characters, the circumstances that would lead them to their death, Shelley's funeral, never happened? I can defend this movie for a lot of things, but this ending, honey, it's not one of them. It's stupid. And I hate it. And I understand why Bill would want to distance himself from that ending. Not only does it not work for how this film is set up, but the story of the crow and his vengeance, it's about pain and emptiness and trying to come to terms with a profound loss. You can't just undo it. The Crow is a dark story, but they always end on a positive, if somber note, with Eric and Shelley being reunited in the afterlife. And in no Crow story has it ever been possible to bring a loved one back from the dead for good. I can appreciate a lot of things here up to a point, but this ending is just so indicative of the raging boner Hollywood continues to have for franchises, and I feel like no one learned anything from the output of the previous sequels. The sense of finality is not something Hollywood has ever been comfortable with, but given again the different stories we see from different Crows, we didn't need for this Eric nor for this Shelley to be hinted at having a future other than death. It's a huge disappointment. It also eliminates the catharsis we get with the end of the film. After everything Eric has been through, he gets to be reunited with Shelley. I mean, that's part of what we're rooting for, waiting for, hoping Eric gets to go back to, and then it's just gone. It's a huge disappointment, and it doesn't fit with the film narratively, which can tell us a little something about the production. This is all conjecture, but here's what may have happened. The Crow 2024 actually has a lot in common with the other Crow sequels, particularly City of Angels and Salvation. City of Angels may have been decent if it wasn't edited beyond recognition. Salvation may have had a shot at box office success if the studio had put in any effort to market it and didn't limit its release to one theater in Spokane, Washington. And The Crow 2024 will not be a box office success because the movie wasn't marketed well at all, but also because whoever was in charge wanted it to come off as a remake even though it's not. Let's go back to when talks of this film first began, back when Momoa was attached, back when Hiddleston was attached, and back when Luke Evans was attached. This version of the story was called The Crow: Reborn. All the sequels and anthologies have had another title: The Crow: Dead Time, The Crow: Salvation, The Crow: Skinning the Wolves. At some point in the process, the decision was made to drop the colon and the second title. That's strike one. Now, even if it isn't a remake, and we've established that it's not, people are going to see the title, understandably assume it's a remake, and judge it accordingly. And now you have two camps of people: those who won't go see the film because it's just another remake that isn't needed, and those who will go expecting to see an update to Draven's story and will be disappointed because it's nothing like the original. And it's not even another adaptation either. So congratulations, you've now set the movie up for failure. And it's not like there isn't an audience for this. People who love the graphic novels and keep up with them have been wanting to see another story adapted. Not necessarily Eric's, but someone's. Those people aren't going to see this movie either because you've positioned the film as redoing Eric's story. Then you release a trailer that completely misses the tone of the film. Let's see. The soundtrack of the film features Joy Division, Gary Newman, 𝖒𝖏𝖈, and the Veils. And the trailer has a song by Post Malone. Nothing wrong with Post Malone, but you can understand how that's misrepresenting the film, right? It would be like me making a movie about a 2000s pop era and using a song by Black Sabbath. I'm not saying they should have used a song from one of the artists on the soundtrack necessarily, but definitely a song that at least fits with the film tonally, a tone they established partly with the soundtrack. This speaks to something that's been a recurring theme in the Crow franchise, excluding 1994 of course, and that is simply studios don't know how to market this. They don't know how to make it. They don't understand what made it special, and they don't trust that people will like it. City of Angels was barely marketed, same with Salvation, and we're seeing the same thing happen with this one. I go to the movies all the time, and since the trailer was released, I've seen it twice. For reference, I've seen the trailer for 𝖘𝖘𝖚𝖗, a small indie film that cost about $7 million to make, enough for 2 lifetimes. But the trailer for The Crow, which was made on a budget of $50 million, just twice. And if I'm saying that as someone who goes to the movies all the time, imagine people who only go once a year. They probably don't even know this exists. Lionsgate has already sunk the movie because they don't care. It seems that from the earliest reactions of the first still they released, they decided it would be a failure and have now acted accordingly. They don't believe in the movie enough to promote it, but they should, because I know that ending was changed at the last minute. The way 𝖕𝖚𝖘𝖚 spoke about the ending tells me that he didn't sign on to the project with that ending in the script. There were most definitely rewrites. You can also tell these changes were last minute because they make so little sense and they actually undo a bunch of things that were previously established in the story. The Crow is a series where anthology works best. There would have been plenty of room to tell another adaptation in the future, but the studio can't understand that. So instead of letting the movie have the ending it deserved, it left it open for future installments. But they don't even believe in the movie enough to properly promote it. So this ending that they forced in for the possibility of future films was completely pointless. Without that promotion, it's not going to do too hot at the box office. Without those box office numbers, there's no sequel anyway. So what was the fucking point? I don't get it. Someone make it make sense. I don't love this movie. I maintain it's not as bad as previous sequels, and I did enjoy the action sequences quite a bit. I can even excuse the bad tattoos because I think that shot of Skarsgård standing on the stage actually looks pretty cool. It's truly a shame about the ending, but if I can live my life enjoying high tension up until the last 10 minutes, I guess I can enjoy parts of this and ignore the ending. Still, it's a shame that whatever studio was financing these films, and at whatever point in history, disregarding 1994, cannot seem to understand what the appeal of them is. Let's go back to what James Gibson had to say when talking about the failed Lazarus movie. In their minds, the franchise wasn't really good for anything more than a couple more straight-to-video releases, which was partly their fault, because they did such a bad job marketing the second one, and they refused to release the third one. They only put it out in a theater in Portland or something, and then it went to video. So it became a self-fulfilling prophecy that it's a diminished franchise that's only worthy of straight-to-video at this point. I think The Crow and all of its comics have stories worth exploring on the big screen. But so long as people like these are in charge, people who can't see what matters about these stories, they are either going to go unseen or unmade. I don't know when we'll see another Crow film, if we ever do, but I do hope whoever ends up involved actually cares about the stories and that someone adapts one of the other comics. Whatever happens, it can't ever change the impact of the first film. Regardless of whatever low-quality sequels come out, the legacy of 𝖕𝖚𝖘𝖚𝖕 and the legacy of Brandon Lee will always remain. To quote 𝖔𝖚𝖘𝖎𝖈𝖊𝖆 once more, as long as someone is loved, they will never die.